As for the Eisenhower 50s, they're really going to get their start after McCarthyism burns itself out, but we'll talk about McCarthyism later. Let's discuss the 50s as a time of a domestic foreign policy that we wanted to get into. As a domestic foreign policy leader, Eisenhower is going to be former five-star commanding general of the armies in Europe for the United States. He's among the most popular men of his era. He's going to lead with sort of a delegator type style. He's going to avoid personal confrontation. And for him, growthism is not the thing. He does not want to expand this New Deal state. His famous phrase was, "Give us the government we need, not gold-plated government." He'll act largely as sort of a caretaker. He's going to try to resist what he called the creeping socialism of the New Deal, but he's not going to dismantle it. He's largely going to maintain things as they were. He's going to balance the budget. He's going to see control of inflation, control of rising prices as our number one economic priority. And he's going to seek to try to stabilize the international and domestic policies as well, not trying to advance for rapid or radical change on either. Be vigilant, but don't be fanatical in terms of domestic policy and also foreign policy when it comes to dealing with the Soviets and fears of communist takeover here at home through the McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Some of his policies, though, definitely were in the New Deal mold, such as the Interstate Highway National Defense Act of 1956. The interstates you travel on today were built in many ways to go back to some ideas as old as Henry Clay about tying the country together. Some 40,000 miles of interstate were built, all in establishing the modern high-speed road network that you know it today. America has always been an automobile-friendly nation. This makes it more so. This, along with favorable housing policies like the Federal Housing Administration, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It's going to make it easy for people to get new homes, and the interstates are going to make it easy for people to transport themselves back and forth. This is going to, in many ways, provide the impetus for the suburbs to be created. Urban America, in some ways, has been on the decline ever since in terms of losing people to these external areas. But we see this as being a major symbiotic thing that goes along with automotive production and suburban development and growth during this time period would be this Interstate Highway Act. It makes the nation automobile accessible. It ties metro areas together, and it still allows even today for the explosion of these suburbs. Corporate oligopoly, bigness in American corporate enterprise was a real common theme you saw during this era. Climbing the corporate ladder for Americans became the middle class ritual, the white collar middle class ritual. And this is symbolized in films and books like The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and William White's The Organization Man, which said that in many ways the training of a generation of Americans through the New Deal and because of their service in the war had trained them to be people who worked together but also followed orders and went along with consensus. And so some of the logic was this was why socially the 50s were so straight-laced, or at least that was the reputation they received in many ways of being straight-laced. You had big labor as well as big industry. The AFL and CIO, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, they merged during this time period to kind of try to present a united labor front against things like the Taft-Hartley Act and rollback. So organized labor is interested in stabilizing and keeping the gains they've got. Corporate America is interested in many ways in extending or dominating industry by a few large firms, extending on a nationwide basis. You see during this time period the birth of chain stores. You see the birth of franchise operations and franchise restaurants, which results in a homogenizing or a samifying, if you will, to make up a word, a samifying of the nation. If you go and find the retail strip, the retail area in your town or community or near you, you will find a lot of the same restaurants, same stores, same retail stores, same grocery stores, same auto dealerships that you would find in any other retail strips in any number of locations and communities across the country. So the American experience begins to become nationalized in that sense. And through advertising and consumer culture, objects of desire are now seen as objects to have as Americans pursue this good life through pursuing the goods life. Television, in many ways, will become the ultimate advertising machine or transmitter of social values. And it's the ultimate entertaining machine as well, and you share images nationally over the airwaves in a way that gives people a common national culture, also contributing to the idea of the 50s as being a time when people had uniform shared beliefs because they all had uniform shared cultural experiences. At least that is the reputation. In terms of clean cut sort of being the norm, the nickname of a MRS degree, or Mrs. degree, something like 2/3 of college women in the 1950s stopped before completing their degree. And the reason was they went to college not to necessarily finish their degree, but they went to college and met the man who's going to be their future husband who finished his degree. And then this is where the baby boom comes in. After this, you see these people settling down and starting their families right away. So with things like Dr. Spock's baby book, childcare becomes a national topic of conversation. The public school movement is enormous during this time. Many of the schools you see across the country are built in this era because we have this massive need. With the baby boom, they're a bubble pushing through society. When they were children pushing through, primary schools were the thing. In the 60s, when they're all college kids, we see this enormous growth on college campuses. Now, where we are in a country today with the graying of America, the baby boomers are all heading towards Social Security age. We see retirement and issues of Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. That bubble is pushing through that element generationally. Wherever the baby boomers have gone, they've left a major impact on our policies and our domestic culture as they've traveled through the various age brackets of our society. This is also the era then of the baby boomers as youth culture. We see rock and roll music getting its origins out of African-American rhythm and blues music from the earlier period. Elvis Presley was gold during this era because he was a white popularizer of, was able to make African-American music with its roots acceptable to the white mainstream. And so not all Americans found white American middle-class society to be desirable. They found some of, like the Lost Generation in the 1920s, they found some of the conformity a bit revolting. And you see this manifest itself in the beatnik or the beat movement, the beats of the 1950s. People like Jack Kerouac was on the road, Alec Ginsberg as one of his colleagues and contemporaries as well, who rejected the conformity of middle-class America, rejected the blind eye that middle-class America put towards other issues of society, like civil rights, like equality, like labor in the workplace, and saw it as being, American society as being sort of empty in some ways after fighting to save the world from fascism. Not unlike how Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and the Lost Generation in F. Scott Fitzgerald saw the 20th society as sort of empty after pursuing the very important goals of saving the world for democracy, as we thought World War I was supposedly being fought for. So with youth culture, social conformity, television homogenization, we see the 50s have always sort of been viewed as this era of so-called happy days. There is still this undercurrent of civil rights stirrings that come out during this time. It was not all as placid as it may seem. And so the overt sexuality of rock and roll and disregard for respected authority that you saw in rock and roll, the tensions of youth culture, you're also seeing tensions of social culture involving elements of race. And it's not coincidental then that African American music will be transformed through its backbeats and rhythms into rock and roll, which is going to be consumed by popular white youth culture as well. But on to those civil rights stirrings. We'd seen Jackie Robinson, as we'd previously mentioned, break baseball's color line in 1947. Truman integrates the military in 48, as we talked about. And these are in many ways building up to the key legal decision of the 20th century on civil rights, which was Brown versus Board of Education. In this decision, which you always see on the multiple choice exam in lots of formats, this decision reverses the Plessy versus Ferguson case from earlier, which said that as long as facilities were separate but legal, or separate but equal, they were constitutional. In this decision of the Warren Court, it's ruled that a separate facility for blacks and whites, whether it's restaurants, hotels, schools, whatever, by its very nature cannot be equal, and the state has to provide fully integrated services. In the South, this is going to lead, of course, to tremendous pushback, and we'll see federal troops deployed to the South for the first time since Reconstruction in places like Little Rock Central High School, where Dwight Eisenhower sends in the 101st Airborne Division to make sure the school gets integrated after local and state authorities say, we can't control it, or we don't want to do it, or we're not going to do it. It's the closest you get to a dialogue on nullification since the end of the Civil War and since the end of Reconstruction. We see also during the growth of this time a nonviolent protest movement organizing around economic activism. The Montgomery Bus Boycott is the best and first example of this. These are things you've probably learned at least since middle school forward, involving characters such as Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, the Student Christian Leadership Coalition. Long story short, to fight to fully integrate the bus, to force African Americans to not have to sit in the back of the buses and give up their seats, the African American community in Montgomery and later on other places in the South results to economic warfare. And they say, we're going to boycott, not use the bus system at all. And through voting with our dollars, not using them, force the white South to come around. Ultimately, they win on getting the white South to desegregate their bus and transportation lines in certain cities. And we also see in the same time period then, this nonviolent movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is going to organize ministers and churches to help sort of supervise and collaborate on these boycotts on a local, state, and a regional basis. And by February of 1960, college students, both black and white, were engaging in what were called sit-ins. They were going into lunch counters in the segregated South, and blacks were sitting in the whites, and whites were sitting in the black section of these lunch counters, and forcibly integrating them and resisting, or when the police came, they would not resist, allowed themselves to be arrested, and they were filling the jails. This is civil disobedience. They weren't being violent. It's nonviolent resistance, but it's showing how these laws, they seem as being unjust and immoral, and also once you fill the jails, it starts to become a criminal justice prosecution problem for the local state governments. The SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was formed a few months after these initial sit-ins to try to also organize this movement at the state, regional, and national level to integrate the nation's department stores, lunch counters, and all sorts of public and public-private services. They're going to ultimately be successful in integrating things such as pools and schools and libraries and hotels and restaurants and laundries all throughout the South and throughout the United States. But it's going to be a process that's going to be actively resisted by the white establishment as it goes forward. White citizens councils and citizens defense leagues trying to essentially keep the status quo in the South, which was this Jim Crow segregated society. The struggle that's going to take place throughout the rest of the 60s, though, will be part of our unit more on the 1960s, as the Eisenhower 50s sets the stage for that element in many ways.